it's so emblematic of maybe those really small things that sometimes cause major rifts between people. And
Mhm.
I remember, in my own words, seeing big things blow up over what seems like not a huge deal. This is one of those cases where the seed and the apostasy are kind of put down in this dispute. If somebody had just apologized and said, I'm sorry, they could have moved on, but it just gets worse and worse.
Casey, I am so excited to have you back on the podcast for round 2. I know I've told you this like 3 times, but that Oliver Cowdery episode that we did before, it was life-changing for me. I have listened to that episode more times on the podcast than I have any of our other episodes. What it taught me was that things that happened in church history and the early building up of the church are mirrors of things that happen today, and really understanding how they navigated these different things. It's like a roadmap for how we can handle hard situations and how we can do things. And it was like a light bulb moment for me. And it's funny because I work in a startup tech software company, and also I think this podcast could be considered a startup, if you will.
Yeah.
And there's just so many things that I could relate with and lessons that I learned from that episode. And so as we're studying D&C and Come Follow Me, and I've been watching these little Come Follow Me videos with my kids, and the one that I watched recently was about Thomas B. Marsh. And so I was like, I need to reach out to Casey and see if we can get him back on. And my husband had actually suggested that we do Thomas B. Marsh's story on the podcast. You just so happened to be studying him at the time.
Yeah, it was weird because I read a bunch of stuff about him in the morning, and then you called me about an hour later, and I thought, oh, this is serendipity that I'm reading about Thomas B. Marsh and you called and asked about him. Now, we may have been connecting because, Section 31 of the Doctrine and Covenants is given to Thomas. And so that might have put him on our radar too. But he's a fascinating guy. He really is. And in a lot of ways, his story is sad. I do the same thing as you, Ashley, where when I read these stories in church history, I sort of connect them to our time and realize that times change, but people and their basic natures don't change. And it might help those who are discouraged about loved ones who've left to know that there's always been this complexity of people coming and going from the church. It's a story as old as time, right? Where people discover the gospel and they fall in love with it. And then complexities come up in their life and they might depart from it, but hopefully they come back. And even if they don't, we have an obligation to love and support them. And Thomas Marsh really kind of illustrates that too. He's a more challenging story than Oliver Cowdery. I'll give you that, but there might be more intrinsic lessons wrapped up in his story too.
I'm so excited. I told my mom this morning that we were doing this, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, I was just learning about him." And she was so excited too. So I'm sure it can't just be us. That's a small sample size here. So there's got to be a lot of people that want to learn more about Thomas Marsh. Ever since we did that Oliver Cowdery episode, and since we've been studying the Doctrine and Covenants, it's made me realize people are just humans, and we deal with the same stuff back then that we do today. And so I'm so excited to hear Thomas's story and what we can learn.
Yeah, and that's the major thing to remember about history is that it becomes a lot more relatable when you realize these are people and
Mhm.
as you get to know them and you read their writings and study their lives, they kind of become more fully fleshed out characters to you and you can understand them a little bit better. And once you appreciate their humanity, there's that whole phenomenon where when you're distant from someone, they seem larger than life. Like when I was a kid, I remember thinking the missionaries had it all figured out. They
Mhm.
they know exactly what they're doing. And then I became a missionary and realized No, they don't. And then it's like your parents where you think, oh, they always know what to do. And then you're like, no, they don't when you become a parent. And
Mhm.
I think it goes all the way up to like president of the church where they seem so put together, but when you start to look at their lives, you realize, oh, their lives are messy too. Russell M. Nelson was raised in a part member family, partially active, wasn't baptized until way after his 8th birthday, threw his dad's liquor cabinet out and broke everything. Like, these are all relatable people. And maybe we do them a bit of a disservice by placing them too high on a pedestal. They're just
Mhm.
like us.
Agree. I love that so much. Well, awesome. Let's jump into the story.
Okay. Well, the first thing that I should point out is I am a BYU professor, but if everything had gone according to plan, I would not be at BYU. I would be at TMU, Thomas Marsh University, because Thomas Marsh was the original president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in this dispensation. And that means that if everything had proceeded the way it did and he'd stayed in the church, he probably would have stepped in as Joseph Smith's successor in 1844. And by the way, Brigham Young was not even the second person in line. The next person in line was David Patton. So we could be a DPU right now. David Patton was killed in Missouri around the time that Thomas Marsh left the church. And so the third in line, Brigham Young, stepped forward and becomes this amazing leader. And that's where the school that I'm at was named after. But that kind of shows how large Thomas B. Marsh looms in our memory, that he's a profound, amazing leader in the early church. But because he leaves, he sometimes has a lot of scorn heaped on him. And I hate to say this too, but sometimes the reasons why he left are oversimplified as well, to where even almost 200 years later, we're not giving him the sort of charity that we sometimes do for other people. And by the way, he does come back. Yeah, he comes back 18 years after he leaves. But that's part of the story too, is this deals with a person coming back, but also people having bitter feelings towards someone that they feel betrayed them, because it seems like Brigham Young and a lot of the other leaders of the church really struggled when Thomas B. Marsh came back after what he had done. And then reconciliation, kind of at the end, where they are able to connect again as friends, and Thomas B. Marsh dies in the church. Thomas B. Marsh is mentioned in a bunch of places in the Doctrine and Covenants, but the two sections that kind of connect the big parts of his life are section 31 of the Doctrine and Covenants and section 112 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 31 is received right when Thomas B. Marsh is investigating the church. And here's the story. He lives in Massachusetts, but he gets a prompting one day that he's supposed to travel west. And as he's traveling west, he starts to head into upstate New York. Again, this is around 1830 or so. He starts to hear these people talking about this new big thing, the Gold Bible. He wonders what that is and eventually gets pointed in the direction of Palmyra, which is right on the Erie Canal. It was a common path that people would take when they traveled west. And so he goes to Palmyra, and there is no Book of Mormon. It hasn't been published yet, but he's so anxious to know about it, he goes to the publisher. He goes to E.B. Grandin's bookstore, and somewhere along the way runs into Martin Harris, one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and he's not able to take a copy of the Book of Mormon home with him, but they do give him a proof sheet. So when the Book of Mormon was printed, they originally had like 16 pages on a big sheet of paper, and then 16 pages on another side, and then they would fold it up and cut it off and fold those together and make an entire book. Because they don't have the book, they hand him one of these proof sheets, and he goes home with 16 pages of the Book of Mormon. And that is enough to convince him that something very special is happening here. And it's so much so that he goes home and kind of tells his family, hey, I think I found something amazing. We're going to move to Palmyra. And so he moves and joins up with the church around September 1830. And that's when Section 31 is received. So Section 31, the Lord commends him. Thomas, my son, blessed are you because of your faith in my work. Behold, you've had many afflictions because of your family. Now, this is maybe foreshadowing. Nevertheless, I will bless you and your family, yea, your little ones, and the day cometh that they will believe and know the truth and be one with you in my church. Lift up your heart and rejoice, for the hour of your mission has come. All these classic missionary phrases are delivered to him. And he joins the church gladly. His entire family joins. He becomes one of the more effective missionaries in the church during this time and has a whole bunch of things happen to him. Eventually, not only moves from New York, but moves to Kirtland, is deeply involved in the church there. And in 1835, he is called as one of the original Quorum of the 12. Now, this is where it gets a little complicated, all right? Because seniority in the 12 is a big deal. How long a person served. When Gordon B. Hinckley was asked once, how do you become the prophet? He said, you get made a member of the Quorum of the 12 and then you outlive everybody else. That's his description of how it works. So all these apostles are called simultaneously in February of 1835. And so seniority is going to be a big deal, but how do you determine seniority if two apostles are called at the same time? Well, it's still the rule that we follow in the church today, which is if two apostles are called at the same time, the older apostle is ordained first. So back in 2005, Dieter F. Uchtdorf and David Bednar were called. Elder Uchtdorf was older than Elder Bednar, so he's the senior apostle. He was ordained first. And that's the same rule they follow in 1835. Now, weirdly enough, Thomas B. Marsh wasn't ordained first. They went out of order, but then when they had to determine seniority in the 12, they went by age, and Thomas believed he was the oldest. That's another weird wrinkle to the story. Is he thought he was the oldest, and he wasn't being dishonest, but he misremembered his birthday.
Oh,
Which,
okay.
I mean, birthdays weren't as big a thing back then. Thomas believed that he had been born in 1799 when actually was born in 1800. And so when we went back and found the census records, we found out that David Patton was actually older than him and probably should have been the president of the Quorum of the 12. But no deception here, okay? Everybody's trying to be honest. We don't even know this until census records come out years later. And so he's made president of the Quorum of the 12. And he organizes the Quorum of the 12. The 12 go on missions. At this time, the 12 were sort of different than the way they function now, where they're sort of the right-hand people to the first presidency. In 1835, the 12 were sort of like a traveling high council. So in places where there weren't stakes, the 12 were expected to go and organize things. And Thomas does this, and he does a really, really good job. Like, he's a really effective leader. And the quorum, it has some ups and downs under his leadership, but for the most part, he's pretty good at what he does. Now, when does he start to run into trouble? That's the other bookend. So in the Doctrine and Covenants, if you go to section 112, that's the second section that's addressed to Thomas B. Marsh. And this is happening in the middle of the Kirtland apostasy. And in Kirtland, there's this severe apostasy. They had a lot of people that didn't have a lot of resources moving into Kirtland, and they were trying to figure out a way to pay for them to have homes and farms. One idea that they floated was, let's launch our own bank. To get everybody to invest in the bank, they go around and say, yes, put your money into this. It will help everybody, and we'll all prosper together. And unfortunately, through a combination of circumstances, the bank fails. Some of these things were way out of their control. There was a huge financial crisis that year, and hundreds of banks failed throughout the United States. Some of these things were in their control. There was some corruption in the bank. We can see from the bank records, Joseph Smith wasn't involved in anything untoward, but some of the clerks were. And the other thing was, there was a concerted effort by people in other communities to make the bank fail. So if you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, the whole thing where everybody pulls their money out of a bank and it fails, that happens to the Kirtland Bank. And that tests a lot of people. This is where several members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles start to criticize Joseph Smith. Some of them, like Luke and Lyman Johnson and William McClellan, are excommunicated from the church. Thomas B. Marsh has a minor crisis of faith here, not because of anything to do with the bank, because of something that has to do with kind of his personal pride, which is he saw himself as the head of the 12 apostles, and that it was his job to direct them. While all this stuff is happening in Kirtland, Joseph Smith approached Heber C. Kimball, who's one of the apostles, and tells him, Heber, the Lord has whispered to me, let my servant Heber depart over the waters and teach the gospel to the people of the nation of Great Britain. So it's going to be the first foreign mission in the church. And Heber C. Kimball is asked to go, and he takes Orson Hyde and a couple other people with him. Heber and Orson are both members of the Quorum of the 12. Now, Thomas is really upset that Joseph Smith does this. He feels like the quorum is his job, that he's in charge of the quorum, and that if a mission call is issued, it's supposed to come from him and through him, that he should have got the revelation. So he approaches Joseph Smith and is sort of ticked off feels like Joseph Smith has overstepped his boundaries. And so Joseph Smith receives a revelation on his behalf that sort of rebukes him. For instance, verse 15. And by the way, this revelation is to the entire 12, but parts of it are addressed specifically to Thomas. Verse 15, exalt not yourselves, rebel not against my servant Joseph, for verily I say unto you, I am with him. My hand shall be over him, and the keys which I have given unto him, and also unto you word, shall not be taken from him till I come. Verily I say unto you, my servant Thomas, thou art the man whom I've chosen to hold the keys of the kingdom as pertaining to the 12. So the Lord says, yes, you're right. You're in charge of the 12, but you're also supposed to serve under the direction of the first presidency. And then there's this really famous phrase that actually gets turned into a hymn in the church where the Lord tells him, be thou humble, and the Lord thy God will lead thee. So Thomas is sort of rebuked, and to his credit, at this point in time, he repents, he reforms, he works to unite the quorum of the 12, and stays with Joseph when several members of his quorum depart because of the complexities over the Kirtland Bank. Thomas works to unite them and brings some of these people back into the church. And when it comes time to abandon Kirtland, because they eventually have to, the crisis gets so bad that most of the faithful members of the church in Kirtland relocate to Missouri. Thomas goes with them. And when he gets there, he becomes sort of a hardliner too. There was corruption happening in the church in Missouri, and they found out that some of the leaders of the church had been selling land to church members at inflated prices. And Thomas is asked to intervene on that behalf. So he takes part in several church councils where they have to excommunicate prominent members, people like W. Phelps, the guy who writes The Spirit of God. He eventually comes back. That's a great story, by the way. We ought to do another episode on him.
Yes.
Thomas takes place in several of these excommunications. He's there when Oliver Cowdery is excommunicated.
From the Oliver Cowdery episode, he was
Yeah.
half excommunicated, half left. He was like, I'm not getting excommunicated, I'm leaving.
You can't fire me, I quit kind of situation where they excommunicate Oliver, but he's already sent in a letter resigning his membership of the church. So whether or not he's excommunicated, is
Still,
tomato.
yeah.
But the guy on the other side of the table is Thomas Marsh. And he's sort of like participating in these hearings that he feels are cleansing the church. But at the same time, there's trouble lingering. This is where it gets complicated, because there's one story that's always told about Thomas B. Marsh, about the reason why he left. And it's a true story, and it is a factor in why he left, but it might be an oversimplification. So maybe you've heard of the cream stripping story.
Yes,
Ever heard
my
this before?
mom just brought this up this morning when we were talking about this.
Okay, so this did happen. And I'll recount the story for our listeners. Apparently, Thomas's wife, Elizabeth, had an arrangement with a lady named Lucinda Harris, where they would basically take the milk and they would share the milk and the cream strippings, which was sort of like the best part of the milk that you could scoop off and use to make, really good butter or cheese. And again, this is sort of foreign territory for us, right? But apparently Elizabeth, Thomas's wife, was accused of stealing the cream strippings, like taking more than she was supposed to. And it got to be so acrimonious that the leaders of the church became involved. Like Edward Partridge, who's the bishop of the church, held a meeting and they ruled against Elizabeth. And Thomas was so incensed that he appealed to the first presidency. Like, imagine going into the first presidency to say, hey, this lady's stealing my butter, that kind of stuff. And they again rule against Elizabeth, say, well, it seems like from everybody that we've talked to and from all the information we have that she was guilty of stealing these cream strippings. And Thomas gets really upset. And according to people that were there, he said, I will sustain the character of my wife, even if I have to go to hell for it. That's the quote that always gets shared.
That is a devoted husband right there.
Now, let me fill in the historical record a little bit here. A guy named Henry Bigler attended the trial, and this is the way he described it. He said, the bishop and others pled with Elizabeth to make things right, even offering to give her time to do so. But no, she called on God and angels to witness her innocence. At this, she says, the prophet, this is Joseph Smith, jumped up and said, Sister Marsh, you lie like the devil. And so Joseph accuses her, and it's so emblematic of maybe those those really small things that sometimes cause major rifts between people. And
Mhm.
I remember, in my own words, seeing big things blow up over what seems like not a huge deal. This is one of those cases where the seed that is apostasy are kind of put down in this dispute. If somebody had just apologized and said, I'm sorry, they could have moved on, but it just gets worse and worse.
They're building up the church. They're doing this good thing for the Lord, and they are not free of problems, like petty problems, arguments and butting heads and rifts coming between them. They're not free of that, even though they are trying to do something really good. You know, these things come up because people are people no matter
Yeah.
where you go. Inside the church, outside the church, no matter what good thing we're trying to do, it's like people are still people. And maybe Joseph could have maybe not said, "You lie like the devil." That was a little harsh, but
Yeah.
like people are people no matter what.
Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because we usually tell this story to like sort of make light, like, oh, they left over such a dumb thing. But I mean, from Thomas's perspective, I could see it a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like one time somebody mildly insulted my wife, and I'm still a little salty towards that person. Like, hey, who the heck do you think you are? And this is my wife. And I get that he's being honorable here. This is what she says happened. I'm on her side. I'm her husband. But that's not the only reason why he leaves, and maybe it's a huge oversimplification of why he leaves too. It does seem like it happened. Multiple people attest that it happens. George A. Smith, who's the church historian, tells this story at General Conference as he's compiling the history of the church. But it's the only story that's been affixed to why Thomas B. Marsh left, and it's part of the story, and it's true, but it's not the only reason why he leaves. The same time in Missouri, the cream strippings story happens. Tensions between the church and the original settlers of the area start to increase. The original settlers are worried that so many church members are gathering that they're going to get outvoted in every election. Some members of the church are saying, hey, we've been pushed out of Jackson County and out of Kirtland. We're sick of this. If anybody messes with us again, we're going to fight back. And there's this war of words that eventually escalates into just outblown violence in the fall of 1838. And so Thomas is in the middle of this too. The side of the story that doesn't always gets told that maybe justifies him a little bit more, not entirely, but a little bit more, is that he was uncomfortable with some of the rhetoric that was being thrown around. Like we talk at length about the extermination order issued against the church in Missouri, but the first person to use the word extermination was a church member. It was Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon gives this big speech on the 4th of July, 1838, where he says, if they come against us, it will be a war of extermination. Now, later on, that word is going to be thrown back in our faces as violence does break out. But there's a gradual escalation, and many members of the church felt like, hey, violence is justified if we're defending our homes. This is Book of Mormon territory. We're defending our homes and our families and our religion. So we are justified in fighting back. And Thomas did not feel okay about this. In October, when the violence is starting to increase, and just to give you kind of a longitudinal perspective, the extermination order is going to be issued at the end of October. Hans Mill happens at the end of October. Thomas B. Marsh counsels people saying, don't go forth boasting of your faith or of the judgments of the Lord. Go in the spirit of meekness and preach repentance unto the children of men. So he's trying to calm down the violence, but then the violence just continues to escalate until it seems like there's members of the church that are saying we're justified if we attack them because they've been attacking us. And there was a back and forth. The Missourians attacked a Latter-day Saint village named DeWitt. They forced everybody to leave. The Latter-day Saints appealed to the governor, a guy named Lilburn Boggs, who at the time says, I'm not going to intervene. You have to fight it out amongst yourselves. So after that, Latter-day Saint militia attack a non-Latter-day Saint town called Gallatin and destroy several structures there. And Thomas is getting really uncomfortable with the rhetoric and the violence that he sees increasing. And it's in the middle of this that he leaves the church. So he basically takes his family, takes his belongings, and he leaves far west. And he's not the only one, too. He goes with an apostle named Orson Hyde. So President Quorum of the 12 and another member leave. And they leave because they're worried about the violence that's incurring. Now, That's bad. And a lot of people felt really, really betrayed by this. So a couple months later, Brigham Young excommunicates Thomas B. Marsh. And from this angle, you're saying, well, he didn't want there to be violence. A guy's worried about his family. That's justified. But he does do something here that really, really, really upsets the leaders of the church, which is after he leaves, he not only leaves the church, but he goes to the authorities in Missouri and swears out an affidavit against Joseph Smith. This is partially what Thomas B. Marsh writes. He writes, the Mormons who refused to take up arms were told they should be shot or put to death. I've heard the prophets say he would yet tread on his enemies and walk over their dead bodies. And then he writes, I left the Mormons and Joseph Smith for conscience sake, and that alone, for I have come to the full conclusion that he is a very wicked man, notwithstanding all my efforts to persuade myself to the contrary. I am well convinced that he will not escape the just judgments of an offended God. So he accuses the saints of fomenting the violence, when almost 200 years later, with perspective, we can see that there was tons of stuff happening on both sides. And the saints that are talking about violence are, for the most part, talking about defensive violence. Like when it finally does come to violence, Joseph Smith tries to negotiate a peaceful settlement. He tries to make sure that there is no violence, especially after Hans Mill happens. And most of the deaths in the Missouri War are at Hans Mill, where a Missouri militia unit just comes into the settlement and kills a bunch of people. Now, a lot of historians think that the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, wouldn't have issued his extermination order if Thomas Marsh hadn't said what he said. So Thomas Marsh makes this statement where he says Joseph Smith is out for violence, even calls him a second Muhammad, and says he intends to cut a swath of blood all the way to the coast. And that makes the Missourians, or at least gives them the justification to issue the extermination order, which reads in part, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and exterminated or driven from the state. Their outrages are beyond all description. So his words hurt the church big time. And when the dust settles, Joseph Smith and several other prominent leaders of the church, they go to Liberty Jail. So if you've ever read the stories about Liberty Jail and how tough the conditions are there, Thomas B. Marsh is in no small measure responsible for them ending up in Liberty Jail. It's his statements that by and large put them there. It's rough, okay? David Patton, who replaced Thomas B. Marsh, is killed during the fighting that happens in Missouri. And that's when Brigham Young takes over as leader of the church. So Joseph and Hiram and the entire First Presidency are in Liberty Jail. Brigham Young is the highest ranking leader of the church who's not in prison, and he has to organize an exodus. He has to get everybody out of Missouri under threat of an extermination order. Now, it turns out Brigham Young is really good at exodusing. So it works out. This is sort of like his test drive for 8 years later when he has to lead the saints across the plain. But there is this lingering anger in Brigham Young that Thomas B. Marsh betrayed them, and they got into trouble because he not only left the church, he betrayed the leaders of the church. In fact, Joseph Smith is angry. In Liberty Jail, he writes a letter where he talks about Thomas Marsh and Orson Hyde and writes, Marsh and Hyde, whose hearts are full of corruption, whose cloak of hypocrisy was not sufficient to shield them or hold them up in their hour of trouble, who after having escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of God and became entangled and overcome, the latter end is worse than the first. So Joseph Smith is saying, these guys betrayed us, and they're going to have to pay a price for what they did. Now, the full story is that Orson Hyde, after a couple months, comes back to the church, and Joseph Smith forgives him, and he comes into the church. Joseph Smith assigns Orson Hyde to travel all the way to the Holy Land and dedicate Jerusalem, which he does. Then he comes back, and Germany publishes one of the earliest accounts of the first vision and stays a faithful apostle until the end of his days. Thomas does not come back during this time. Joseph Smith and the saints regroup and regather to Nauvoo. Everything that happens there happens, including the introduction of temple ordinances, plural marriage. Joseph and Hiram are killed, and Brigham Young takes over and leads them across the plains. Now, while all this is happening, Thomas B. Marsh stayed in Missouri, and he's living in Howard County, which is about 100 miles away from Jackson County, where the saints originally tried to settle, and we just don't know very much about his life during this time. But we know that a couple things happened. At some point in the 1850s, Elizabeth leaves him. And apparently there was such a severe break in their marriage that A lot of people, when Thomas came back to the church, believed that Elizabeth had died. We looked up census records and we found out that Elizabeth didn't die, that they separated. We don't even know if they got a divorce, to be honest with you, because we only have census records on her. The other thing that happens is that Thomas has a stroke. He's left partially paralyzed and he's in pretty tough physical shape. And with Elizabeth gone, and a lot of people tie this back to the cream strippings too, like saying, well, once his wife was gone, he came back into the church. He writes a letter to Heber C. Kimball, one of his old fellow apostles. And he writes and says this: I cannot live so long without a reconciliation with the 12 and the church whom I have injured, O brethren, once brethren. How can I leave this world without your forgiveness? Can I have it? Can I have it? Something seems to say within, yes. I know what I have done. A mission was laid upon me, and I never filled it. And now I fear it's too late, but it is filled by another. I see the Lord could get along very well without me. So he's talking about a Doctrine and Covenants 118, where the 12 were called to go on a mission to England. Because Thomas left the church, Brigham Young leads that mission. And it's a total game changer. They convert thousands of British people and move them to America. And by the time he's writing this, Brigham Young is firmly established as the leader of the church. So Thomas is sort of writing back and saying, I know that I left right when we'd been called on a mission and I didn't fill it, but I want your forgiveness. I want to come back. And he starts to make his way back. But again, his stroke has left him partially paralyzed. He stays at Council Bluffs, which is kind of the place where they're organizing people to travel across the plains. A guy named Wandle Mace he stays with, and he describes him. He says he was completely paralyzed. They had to move him in a sheet. While in this condition, he made a determination that if the Lord spared his life and he received sufficiently to help himself, he would return to the church. And as soon as he was able to travel, he left his home in Missouri. So he does eventually cross the plains, and he comes to Salt Lake and sort of offers himself to the church, and they accept him back. Now, this is where the story gets a little complicated too. He gets up to speak in General Conference, and there is still like real bitterness on the part of Brigham Young and several other leaders of the church. Kind of make comments like, can you believe this guy? But Thomas gets up and speaks in General Conference, and he sort of shares his story, and it's incredibly moving for everybody. This is what he says in part. He said, God loved me too much to let me go without whipping me. I've seen the hand of the Lord in the chastisements which I have received. I have seen and know that it has proved he loved me. For if he had not cared anything about me, he would not have taken me by the arm and given me such a shaking. Many have said to me, how is it that a man like you, who understood so much of the revelations of God, as recorded in the book of Doctrine and Covenants, should fall away? And I told them not to feel too secure, but to take heed lest they should also fall. You will not then think nor feel for a moment as you did before you lost the Spirit of Christ. For when men apostatized, they left it grovel in the dark. And I frequently wanted to know how my apostasy began. And I've come to the conclusion that I must have lost the Spirit of the Lord out of my heart. And so he gives this huge speech where he says, you know what, I've metaphorically just been whipped over the last 18 years. And I don't want anybody to be too confident in their testimony. This guy was president of the Quorum of the 12, one of the highest ranking church officers to ever be excommunicated, comes back and says, I just want to rejoin the church. And so there, right in the middle of the conference, there's a vote, and they vote to receive him back into the church. Like, he gets this physical sign from the members of the congregation that they forgive him and they want him to come back. It must have been a huge moment for him. It was the Wild West, right? Like, the guy shows up, take him up on the stand, let him talk, right? And he's speaking extemporaneously. Now, I wish I could say that was the end of the story too, but part of why this story is illustrative is it shows a person leaving the church and then having the humility to come back. But oftentimes there is bitterness on the part of people who stayed in the church, right? And there's sometimes resentment, like, hey, you should have stayed faithful. And in this case, Brigham Young gets up next to speak, and he says some harsh things to Thomas B. Marsh. Now, to put Brigham in context here, he's the one that had to sort of rescue the church in Missouri and lead them across the plains. And there's, I think, still this lingering feeling of, you betrayed us, like you were my leader and you left. Brigham Young gets up and says this, and please don't judge him too harshly. But he says, Brother Thomas considers himself very aged and infirm. And can you see, brothers and sisters, what is the cause of it? He left the gospel of salvation. How? What do you think is the difference between his age and mine? He said. And then he goes, 1 year and 7 months to a day. So he says, look at this guy and look at the condition he's in, and then look at me. We're a year apart in age. And then he makes the statement. He says, Mormonism keeps men and women young and handsome. And when they're full of the Spirit of God, there are none of them but what will have a glow upon their countenances. And this is what makes me young, for the Spirit of God is with us and within us. Ouch. That hurts, right? And you can see in Brigham Young some of this kind of lingering resentment where he feels like, you betrayed us. And he feels like he has to make a public spectacle. And this is maybe Brigham Young at his ugliest, but it's understandable, right? I confess to having feelings like this sometimes too, where I'm like, you know what? You knew so much and you understood that it was true, but you betrayed it. How could you? But that's not the end of the story either. So after this happens, Thomas does still join the church. He doesn't stand up. He doesn't dispute against Brigham Young. He humbly takes his last whipping.
That's
And
honestly so incredible. Clearly, that is evidence of a testimony right there.
yeah.
So,
And it also shows his growth, right? Like
Mhm.
this is the I will sustain my wife if it means I have to go to hell guy. And 18 years later, he comes back and receives a stern rebuke in a public setting, but he takes it. Like he
Mhm.
says, no, I understand. He commits himself to the church. He dedicates himself. In fact, he signs a document September 7th, 1857, where he says, I consecrate and dedicate myself, soul, body, and spirit, with all I possess on the earth to the Lord, and commits to the gospel again. The next month, he gets remarried. He marries a woman named Hannah Adams and is ordained an elder on March 11th, 1859. So it does take a couple years, and later becomes a high priest. He moves to Spanish Fork and becomes a school teacher there. So he never becomes a member of the Quorum of the 12 again. Never holds any high position within the church, just serves within the church. And he stays there for about 10 years. Now, again, you might think, well, maybe Brigham Young was justified. Thomas B. Marsh took it. We did find a note. This is what I was reading when you called me and brought up talking about Thomas B. Marsh, because I had just listened to the Brigham Young sermon. I was like, oh man, this is tough. Like, I love Brigham Young, but sometimes he's a lot, right? There's a little note in Brigham Young's office journal, from 3 years later. And it says, Thomas B. Marsh called upon me. And he and I, this is what it notes in his journal. I talked about old times with him and sung a hymn that we had sung together in old times. Marsh commented that Young's display of kindness made him feel good. And after becoming thoroughly submissive, Young showed charity and mercy. Brigham helps him, helps him get on his feet, helps him get back into the church, helps him get reordained to the priesthood, helps him get set up. So it didn't happen publicly, but there's this little note that's kind of semi-lost to history, because the first history I read of Thomas B. Marsh doesn't mention this meeting. Another historian named John Turner found it and put it in his book on Brigham Young, where privately they meet together, and these two old colleagues sing a hymn and talk about old times and ultimately reconcile. And that to me is the gospel, right?
Mhm.
That all these complicated feelings, you betrayed us. Well, I was just sticking up for my wife. Well, you got us into trouble. You got Joseph thrown in prison. There was an extermination order levied against us. Yeah, I was wrong. I messed up. The Lord had to chastise me to get me to come back. Well, I'm still angry. And then when they finally get the chance to meet privately, it all kind of melts away, right? And they realize that the thing that matters is that they're here together, and they end up together. Thomas lives for a couple more years. He does have some major challenges with mental illness, and it's probably linked to his stroke, but he dies faithful in the church in 1866. His obituary is noted. There was only a wooden marker in the Ogden City Cemetery that just noted Thomas B. Marsh, just the initials TBM. But in 1893, David Stewart, who was the president of the bench district in the Weber stake, gathered everybody together and put in a proper granite marker. And if you go and visit Thomas's Marsh today, it reads as follows. It says, Thomas B. Marsh, the first president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Born in Acton, Massachusetts, November 1st, 1799. Died January 1866, erected by his friends, July 17th, 1893. So that stands, and then in 1920, they put in another marker to commemorate him.
The thing that I love about this story is that when things like happen in the church, there's disagreements or there's arguments or, with people in our ward or whatever, it's like, why is this happening when we're trying to do what's right here? Or why would this person that's a believing active member of the church treat me this way? This is such a beautiful story of forgiveness and humility. And like, I love how Thomas B. Marsh, he humbles himself. My husband and I are missionaries in the 12-step program, the addiction recovery program. And
Mhm.
that is a key theme is humility, is admitting when you were wrong, being humble without being compelled to be humble. We talk about that humility so much. And I hear that so plain as day in his story. Like for him to go in front of all of his fellows and, admit his wrongs. And clearly, if he's coming back to the church, he's got to feel pretty bad about what he did. And then you also have Brigham who's practicing forgiveness. Imagine having to forgive somebody that caused so much heartache and so much problems, and having to forgive them for that would be hard. But then you see them singing together and they're friends again. And man, I love that.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it kind of runs the whole gamut of the human experience, right? Where on the one hand, he wasn't as unjustified as we sometimes make him sound. When you read the entire thing in context, no, he was probably a little justified. Like he was genuinely worried about violence, and there was violence carried out by church members in Missouri. This is where the Danites come into the story, right? At the same time, too, just like you, Ashley, when I served on a stake high council, was present at some of those meetings where people come back into the church. And I used to think that, a church membership council would not be spiritual. It would just always be tough because we're sometimes removing people from the church, taking away their membership. Most of the ones I went to, in fact, the vast majority in my stake were people coming back into the church. And if there was one common characteristic, it was just kind of this deep humility. Like, hey, I know that I was wrong. I just want to make it right. A common question that got asked in those meetings was, how do you feel about the Savior? And a common thing was, the Savior loved me. And I see that in Thomas B. Marsh's words where he says, the Savior loved me, but he loved me enough to whoop me, basically, to
Yes.
to put me in circumstances where I realized that I needed to come back and that I was missing something from my life.
Mhm.
Again, it's remarkable to see the change. And, Orson Hyde, who left the church the same time as him, comes back in and leads a remarkable life of service. If Thomas had come back sooner, that's possible too, but that's all sort of after the fact speculation on our part. The point is that he ended up in the right place and he did the right thing. And under some really adverse circumstances, he showed remarkable humility. And I think that that humility eventually softened Brigham Young's heart to the point to where Brother Brigham could forgive him too for all the trials that they went through because of him. So it's a nice story of reconciliation and these two people that had served closely coming to realize that, hey, it doesn't matter where you've been. What matters is where you're at right now and where your heart is and what your relationship with the Savior is at this moment. Nothing else matters.
That is so good. And also, people can change. People
Yeah.
can and do change. And when you were talking about the disciplinary council in the church, I have interviewed so many people on the podcast that have gone through that disciplinary council, and it is a spiritual experience and
Yeah.
it is a positive experience. It's not this negative, awful thing. It's just like Thomas said, the Lord loved him enough to chastise him. And
The whooping.
I think,
Yeah.
yes, and whoop him. And I've experienced that in my own life. I've experienced times where I felt like I made a wrong decision and I felt rebuked because of it. There was an article in the Leahona a couple months ago, and it talked about the pride cycle and how we get to the top of the pride cycle and then something happens and we're humbled. I mean, that humbling experience, it's refining and it brings you to your knees. And it's just really cool to see how Thomas, made his way through the pride cycle and then he was so humble. And anyway, what a beautiful story.
Yeah. And his humility was really enduring, right? He gives up everything that he has and starts his life over, and I think ends in a good place. It's hard to say because after that meeting with Brigham Young, the sources become a little disparate on Thomas B. Marsh, but I'd like to think he ended in a good place. And I was genuinely touched that in the 19th century, when we pointed to guys like Thomas B. Marsh as don't do this, this is an apostate, that a stake president saw his grave and said, you know what? He may have left the church for a spell, but he deserves a better grave marker than a wood
Mhm.
plank. Let's raise some funds and let's mark the grave of a president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, a great man who made a couple mistakes, but ultimately ended exactly where he was supposed to. So, you know what? I have a deep love for everybody involved in here. And I've been on both sides, right? I felt rebuked by the Lord because I messed up. And there's been times when I've looked at someone who's messed up and felt like genuine resentment, like, how could
Mhm.
you? And realize that, hey, what Satan wants is for us to not forgive. And
Yep.
even if you feel like it's righteous indignation and anger, it ultimately can become poisonous to your soul. So I'm so glad to find that little note that he and Brigham reconciled in his office and ended in a good place too. Because I don't want to think that Brigham Young was bitter the
Yeah.
rest of his life too, even though he had pretty good reason to be angry. But it seems
Mhm.
like he forgave Thomas as well, and they ended as friends.
Yeah. I love it. Well, Casey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and it's so fun to have you back on, and these episodes are so impactful for me. I've never enjoyed historic stories like I do when you're talking to me about these early members of the church. I love them.
Well, and keep in mind, Ashley, that you are an important historian too. You're just documenting modern stories. I mean, 200 years from now, people are going to be talking about your podcast and the story of how this person came back. So we're all historians here, right?
We're
Just
just creating it today.
we're
Yes,
we're you're creating the history, and I'm going back and digging it up, and
I love
I've
it.
had the chance to listen to a few episodes, and I really enjoy what you're doing as well. So I hope you'll keep at it too.
Definitely gonna keep at it.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Casey.
All right. Thanks, Ashley.
A lot of people have asked us how they can support the podcast, and we have created a Comeback Podcast merch line on our website, www.comebackpodcast.org. All of the money made from the merch goes right back into the podcast. So if you are interested in supporting the podcast and you want to purchase some merch, we would love it. Check it out. Thank you so much for being a supporter of the Comeback Podcast and listening to our episodes. It would mean so much to us if you would like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps other people be able to find us, and we want to share this message to everyone.